The world already erased Peter Parker once, and strangely enough, Brand New Day begins with Peter helping it finish the job. On the surface, he seems to be doing well. New York finally trusts Spider-Man, and Peter has become better at saving people. But when the mask comes off, there is barely a life waiting underneath it. He still follows Ned from a distance, he still thinks about MJ, and instead of admitting that he misses them, Peter convinces himself that staying away is the responsible thing to do. And you can understand why. The last person he allowed himself to depend on was Aunt May, and Peter believes being Spider-Man is what got her killed. So in his mind, keeping Ned and MJ out of his life is not cowardice, it is protection. The problem is that Peter does not simply remove himself from their lives, he begins removing Peter Parker from his own. Then his body starts changing, the headaches, the aggression, the heightened senses, and the organic webbing initially look like another mutation Peter needs to control. But the film gradually reveals that his body is not the real problem. It is reacting to a conflict Peter refuses to confront. This is a full spoiler review of Spider-Man Brand New Day. And in a few minutes, I'll show you why the film's real conflict is not Spider-Man fighting Jean Grey, Scorpion, or even Hulk. It is about Spider-Man trying to survive without Peter Parker. For a while, Peter's decision appeared to work. As Spider-Man, he was more effective than ever. Crime was down, the city saw him as one of its protectors, and every hour of his life could be justified by helping someone else. But Peter Parker had almost disappeared. Ned and MJ had spent years at MIT without him. Peter followed Ned online, which showed that he never truly let go. He still wanted to know how they were doing. He just refused to be a part of it. That changed when he unexpectedly saw Ned at a store and decided to follow him to a party. For the first time in years, Peter stood in the same room as the two people who once knew him better than anyone. But to them, he was a stranger. Ned had built a life without him, MJ had a boyfriend, and although she admitted that she sometimes felt as though she was waiting for something she could not name, Peter still felt bound to his secrecy. So he left. No one was keeping Peter away from them. Despite wanting to be there, he was the one choosing the distance. But burying all of that had consequences. His headaches grew worse. His senses overwhelmed him. His body began producing its own webbing. Those changes arrived at the exact moment Peter was forced to confront everything he had spent years avoiding. The film connects his physical instability to the life he has refused to live. So, why did Peter keep Ned and MJ at a distance when doing so clearly hurt him? The answer was Aunt May. Peter believed being Spider-Man was what got her killed. He tried to help people, brought dangerous individuals into their home, and the person closest to him paid the price. Whether that guilt was fair did not matter. Peter believed it. Once grief became guilt, every close relationship began to look like another tragedy waiting to happen. That was why he wrote a letter to MJ but never gave it to her. He wanted to explain who he was and what they once meant to each other, but telling her the truth also meant allowing her back into the dangerous part of his life. Peter was not only afraid that MJ might reject him, he was afraid that she might love him again. Because if she loved him, he could lose her, and if being Spider-Man caused that loss, Peter would have to live with the belief that he had destroyed another person he loved. And honestly, it is difficult to dismiss that fear completely. Peter's life had repeatedly taught him that loving someone made them vulnerable simply because they were close to Spider-Man. But abandoning Spider-Man did not feel like an option. The city still needed him. So Peter surrendered himself to the role completely. Spider-Man needed to keep the city safe, Peter Parker needed companionship. And whenever that human need became painful, Peter's instinct was not to understand it, his instinct was to suppress it. Eventually, that instinct became something physical. Peter's senses sharpened, his headaches intensified, and his abilities developed in ways he could not fully control. At first, some of those changes looked like improvements. He became faster, his spider sense grew stronger, his body began producing its own webbing, but they also made him more aggressive. During his fight with the possessed scorpion, Peter became so consumed by that aggression that he stopped paying attention to the people around him. A police officer was injured because Peter lost the restraint that normally separated him from the criminals he fought. That frightened him, so Peter responded in the most predictable way possible. He created an inhibitor. Rather than asking why these changes appeared as his emotional state became unstable, Peter treated them as a biological malfunction that needed to be contained. But Banner challenged that idea. At the university, Dr. Banner suggested that Peter was trying to control something that actually needed to be expressed. Peter, however, was not ready to hear that. From his perspective, the inhibitor worked. It reduced the headaches, calmed his senses, and returned him to a version of Spider-Man he knew how to be. But that relief was temporary. The inhibitor did not resolve anything. It only forced the changes back down, just as Peter had forced Peter Parker beneath the mask. At first, it was easy to see Jean as the villain. She moved from one body to another, manipulated people, and allowed her anger to endanger innocent lives. But the more Peter learned about her, the harder it became to see her as nothing more than a threat. Jean had spent years searching for her sister after Damage Control took her. When she finally discovered what happened, she learned that her sister had died inside the same facility that treated them as objects to be studied and used. To Damage Control, the sisters were not people. They were valuable because of what they could do. Jean's anger came from somewhere understandable. She lost the person closest to her because other people had reduced both sisters to tools. The tragedy was that, in trying to take back control, Jean eventually began seeing herself the same way Damage Control did. Her power became her entire identity. That is what makes her such an effective reflection of Peter. Both lost the only family they had left because of the abilities that made them different. Peter believed being Spider-Man cost Aunt May her life. Jean knew their powers were why Damage Control targeted them. They responded, however, in opposite ways. Peter surrendered himself to Spider-Man because he believed his power should only protect others. Jean surrendered herself to her power because she believed it was the only way to take control back. Their intentions were different, but the mistake was the same. Both allowed what made them special to become everything they were. Before Peter could convince Jean that she was more than her power, he had to understand the same thing about himself. Now Hulk, as seen in the trailer, was also in the movie. His role could easily have been nothing more than spectacle. Instead, Banner showed Peter what could happen when one part of a person was separated from the other. Jean exploited the division between Banner and Hulk. By suppressing Banner's influence, she allowed a far more dangerous Hulk to take over. Peter could not defeat that version through strength, so rather than trying to overpower Hulk, he tried to reach Banner inside him. That moment reflected Peter's own condition. Peter had treated Spider-Man and Peter Parker as though only one could safely exist. Spider-Man had a purpose. Peter Parker, in his mind, only created attachment, vulnerability, and loss. But ignoring one side did not create balance. It allowed the other to grow without restraint. Peter had already experienced that himself. The more completely he lived as Spider-Man, the more aggressive and unstable he became. The mask was not the problem. The problem was trying to wear it without leaving room for the person underneath. Peter found the answer for Banner before he was ready to apply it to himself. Then Jean forced him to do exactly that. Jean asked Peter to define himself. Was he Peter Parker or was he Spider-Man? After finally seeing the whole picture, Peter replied, "Both." That answer sounds obvious, But Peter had spent the entire film acting as though he had to choose. He treated Peter Parker as the vulnerable half, the part that grieved, needed people, and could be hurt. Spider-Man was the useful half, so that was the identity he tried to preserve. But choosing only Spider-Man had not made him stronger. It left him isolated, emotionally unstable, and unable to control the abilities he depended on. So Peter removed the inhibitor. This time, he did not treat the changes in his body as something foreign. He allowed them to become part of him. The organic webbing remained. His spider sense became stronger. But once Peter stopped fighting the conflict behind those changes, they no longer overwhelmed him. He had not cured himself, he had accepted himself. And that acceptance changed how he confronted Jean. He reached the person beneath the power, the girl who had spent years searching for her sister only to learn she had been killed, and whose grief had consumed everything else she was. Peter reminded Jean that Damage Control had treated her as a tool, but she did not have to keep seeing herself through their eyes. Her powers were part of her. They were not all she was. Peter could finally tell her that because he had reached the same conclusion about himself. Spider-Man was not a mask he needed to escape, and Peter Parker was not a weakness he needed to erase. He was both. That answer only mattered if it changed the way Peter lived, and the ending showed that it did. Earlier, Peter watched Ned from a distance. He followed his life online, went to the party, introduced himself to Ned and MJ under a fake name, and left before allowing either of them back into his life. By the end, he approached Ned. Ned still did not remember their history, but Peter joined him in the handshake they once shared. It was a small moment, yet it represented something Peter had avoided for years. He allowed himself to make contact. The film did not suddenly restore everything he had lost. Ned and MJ did not remember him, and Peter was not rewarded with the exact life he wanted back. That is important. Peter's growth was not proven by the world returning Peter Parker to him. It was proven by his willingness to begin living as Peter Parker again, even without knowing what those relationships would become. The same change appeared in his relationship with Frank. Peter had spent most of the film believing that protecting people meant carrying every responsibility alone. But after everything that happened, he finally allowed someone else to stand beside him. And when he spoke to Aunt May, he made a promise that completed the journey. He would not do this by himself anymore. That is why I enjoyed watching Brand New Day. It used Peter's changing powers, Jean's grief, and Banner's divided identity to explore the same idea without making all three characters identical. What makes someone extraordinary can become destructive when it consumes everything else they are. Peter did not need to stop being Spider-Man. He needed to stop using Spider-Man as a place to hide from being Peter Parker. The world still had not remembered Peter, but by the end, Peter finally had. If you enjoyed this kind of character analysis, you should watch my Man of Steel video next. Because just like Brand New Day, that film becomes much more interesting once you stop judging its hero by the version people expected and start looking at the person underneath instead. You can watch that video right here. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you over there.